at the 21st Annual International Conference on Comparative Cognition. This year we're honoring Tom Zentall, and Tom has agreed to sit down with us and be questioned about his career and some of its insights into comparative cognition. So thank you, Tom, for taking your time today.
Glad to do it.
So my first question for you today is, how did you get interested in comparative cognition?
Well, I think it came about, the first study I ever did was with children. I discovered that working with humans, working with kids, and later with adults, was very complicated because what they said they were doing didn't seem like what they were doing in terms of the data, and worrying about what they expected when they came into the experiment. Some of the children got very upset about the test that they were being tested, and had to reassure them. They had to go to the bathroom in the middle. Anyway, it just seemed very complicated, and Al Riley was interested in whether generalization gradients were something that was built into organisms, and he had been studying children at the time. And so we decided to work with an animal where we could control its past experience. And the first study I ever did with animals was with Japanese quail, because they're foul and they are precocious and don't require a lot of care when they're young, and they're little, so we could actually raise them with brooders. And so we discovered that generalization gradients are built in, so that when you train a pigeon, Japanese quail, to peck at a yellow light, and then you give it an orange light, it will peck less, and red light, it will peck still less, even though it's never seen those colors ever before. So that got me interested in working with animals, because it's just a lot easier to control their living arrangement and their past experience.
So how did pigeons enter into the equation?
Pigeons, well, a lot of research had been done with pigeons. They turn out to be relatively easy to care for. They are, we call them the farm horse of land animals, in the sense that they work for a little pay and work hard and work every day, and they don't seem to be like other animals, that, especially other birds, that sometimes you have to deal with variability from day to day.
So what events do you see as being important to you in shaping your career?
What events? Well, graduate school was very important. I don't think I ever would have gotten involved in animal research. I wasn't aimed in that direction. I really didn't have a clear idea where I was going, and working with animals just seemed to be a good way to collect data and answer questions that could be described fairly simply, although ultimately ended up being complex, but at least you could simplify the questions.
So at what point did you decide that I would like to be a researcher, college professor? Did that happen in grad school before? What was
it happened in graduate school. Actually, my career, I started out in engineering. I actually have a degree in electrical engineering, and got interested in psychology along the way, and knew that it was experimental psychology. I thought engineering background would be good background for psychology. And in graduate school, I decided that this is one way to stay a student all your life, is to stay in academics. I went to college teaching, so it's decided that.
So your research interests have spanned memory strategies, concept learning, and social learning. So what were the forces that kind of attracted you to these areas? Or pick one if you want to.
Mostly it was reading. I'd read about experiments and decide that the experiment wasn't done properly, that there was an alternative explanation, and I was really driven to figure out if the results of that experiment were accurate, and if once I controlled for things that should have been controlled for, I'd get the same results, and it almost didn't matter what I got, because I could at least rule out an alternative hypothesis. That certainly got me interested in imitation research.
The other areas, same kind of...
Other areas, yeah, sure. So matching the sample. I remember reading a classic paper by Cumming and Berriman on transfer of identity, where they trained with 3 colors and then replaced one of the colors with a novel color. And the results suggested that when you did that, you got no transfer. And the problem was that this novel color was something that the pigeons tended to avoid. So when the novel color was incorrect, they avoided it. And when the novel color was correct, they avoided it. And so it suggested that there wasn't any transfer. And so I said, well, they need to do it by using either familiar colors, which turns out to be a major sort of creative design, or the simpler way is to just use all novel colors. And it turns out you do get significant transfer when you do that. That was one of the first experiments.
So recently you focused on maladaptive choice. Where do you see this research going in the future?
Gee, the more I read of the human literature, things like Kahneman and Tversky's work, there's actually quite a bit of work that's coming out of economics recently about how people make poor economic choices. The earlier work just suggested we really need to educate people better. Of course, the psychologists get a hold of it and say, no, that's a basic principle of human behavior, that we tend to behave inappropriately. And a lot of the explanation for that behavior is that it's culturally based. So some of the work that I've done on sunk cost, which is the tendency to keep doing what you're doing because you started doing it, you invested in it. People say, well, that's because of our cultural ethic of finish what you start, don't give up on things. And I thought, well, would animals do the same thing? Pigeons, and it turns out that they do. And so then there's the other question, which is, why do they do it? I'm not really sure why they do it, but it is an interesting question. They do show that behavior, and it suggests that we become equipped with that tendency. And so whatever culture does is on top of that tendency. So that's sort of the theme of the research that I've been doing the last 15 years or so.
So let me, you mentioned culture. So do animals have cultures?
Depends on how you define culture. Jeff Gallup has written a book, co-authored a book on, co-edited it. The controversy comes up when you talk to people about what culture means. So a better term might be traditions, and animals do have traditions. Certainly, apes, primates, seem to pass on certain kinds of skills to their offspring culturally, in a tradition, as a tradition. And some of Gallup's work on acquired taste preferences suggests that if a rat has eaten a particular flavor and gotten sick, then it will avoid that flavor. If another rat comes in contact with that first rat, it will learn to eat what the other rat ate, and then that can be passed on for several so-called generations. I mean, iterations of the same thing, so that you have rats that have never experienced anything bad coming from a particular flavor, but they will tend to avoid that for a different one than other rats have eaten.
So one of the more recent trends in your research has been working with canines. Can you talk about how you got interested in that and why?
Mostly through a couple of graduate students. The first one, Ellie Miller, was a professional dog trainer. And she, for a couple of years, she asked me if it would be possible to set up a dog lab. I resisted it, telling her how complicated that would be for a lot of reasons, but she kept pushing for it. And she was very good at designing experiments, so I let her do that, and I currently have a friend of hers who's in my lab, Christina Harrison, who is also a professional dog trainer. I wouldn't do it without a student who knew a lot about dogs. There are lots of complications you're dealing with. We deal with pets who are brought in with sort of doggy daycare,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all different breeds, all different ages, all different backgrounds in terms of the amount of training. And so you really need someone who will have experience with dogs. But I let my graduate students go in the direction that they choose to go and see what happens and monitor that. But they've been pretty successful.
So looking back at the body of work that you've published so far at this point in your career, what have been some of your favorite papers that you have?
Favorite papers? That's a very good question. I don't know. One of those is one that's difficult to explain, but it has to do with identity transfer. It's one that I don't think has ever been cited, but it's one of my favorites, in which we figured out how to get around the problem of neophobia in pigeons, where you present new stimuli and they tend not to respond really well to them. But there are ways of getting around that, and it turns out that paper is fairly complicated, but I think the evidence from it is very strong that pigeons, at least, use the relationship between two stimuli as a basis for deciding whether to choose the one that matches or choose the one that doesn't match. That's one of my favorite papers. I guess another one is a more recent paper in Psychological Science, in which this was Holly's idea, comes out of the social psychological literature. Baumeister had been doing research on the effect of resisting, of inhibiting a response on what he labeled ego depletion. And so, I don't know if you know the experiment, there's a plate of cookies on the table, and the subject is told to sit down, and the cookies are meant for another experiment, but not to eat them while the experiment goes out and gets some materials and comes back. And then the test has to do with these problems that they have to solve, soluble problems actually, and how long they persist in working at them. The control group doesn't get cookies, it gets radishes. They're told not to eat the radishes. And they persist much longer. And so Baumeister's explanation has to do with depletion of self-worth somehow, that you had to resist the temptation and the difficulty that you had doing that, and it's fatiguing. And she said, well, she's had the same experience with dogs when she asks them to sit and stay, which turns out to be not an easy thing for dogs to do. One would think that would be relatively easy in the sense of energy requirements, but it turns out to be very energy depleted. And she says you work with a dog for an hour and it literally just falls on the floor and lies down. And so she said, let's try this with dogs. And so we designed a similar kind of procedure where we gave them one of these toys that are made to make them work for their food. You put kibble in it and it can come out, and then you roll it around. And so we give it to the dog for a week, and then the dog comes into the lab, it gets the same toy, but now there's a hot dog in it that won't come out. It's very tempting, and so the dogs will play with it. But the dog that has to sit and stay plays with that toy, gives up a lot sooner than dogs that are just put into a crate and for the same amount of time. And so I think that's very nice. And then the follow-up of that was when someone came along and said, well, if you give humans who have been in a procedure like this, where they've had to resist, if you let them drink a sucrose drink, they will no longer have this depletion. So they were claiming it was blood sugar. And so she tried it with dogs, and it worked just as well with the dogs. So anyway, that's another thing.
Any other favorites? That's only two. I know you've done a lot.
That's only two, yeah, favorites. I guess some of the imitation work I've done, once I got into it, I realized it was very complicated because the kinds of things one has to control for are simple things like just the presence of another animal may facilitate learning a new task. But then there are other complications like drawing attention to whatever the other animal is doing, whether that's pressing a lever, drawing attention to a moving lever might facilitate acquisition of lever tracing by the observer. And so finding a manipulation that would control for all that, we ended up with something which we called the two-action procedure, which is using the same manipulandum, but making a response in two different ways. So with a bird like a pigeon, or we used Japanese quail, they would peck at the treadle or step on the treadle, and the observer does it in the same way. And that controls for a lot of things that the earlier research didn't, so I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, no, it's very neat. So tell me, who are your 3 favorite scientists?
3 favorite scientists. One, I think, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. The reason I think his discovery was really important is because he recognized the importance of serendipitous event. That is, he had put out some agar pieces that he was trying to culture influenza, and the next day he came in and he found that his lines had been corrupted with mold. And instead of throwing them out and starting off from scratch, he recognized that the influenza didn't grow on him, and it should have. And so we thought, maybe there's something special about this mold. So at least one of them. Others, I think, in terms of an influence on psychology in particular, Piaget, great respect for him, although he didn't do a lot of research. He came up with a lot of tasks that are still quite popular today. I mean, some of the work we do with animals, transitive inference is something that he didn't invent it, but he certainly popularized it. And even though it wasn't, it needed perfecting, then people followed up on a lot of the research he did. So there's a lot of animal research that actually comes out of his work. And probably B.F. Skinner, I think, just in terms of, if you look at the research that was done before him, it really involved discrete trial, choice, maze learning, that sort of thing. And the notion of a free operant, letting the animal respond at whatever rate it wants to, really, I think, changed psychology in many ways.
So what do you think the current goals of comparative cognition should be?
Well, I'm not sure. You know, comparative cognition is a fairly broad area. So my personal goals are to really, when we talk about comparative, I think of comparative in terms of humans versus other animals. That we look at human behavior as very complex, and the more we study animals, the more complex we find that they are. And at the same time, the more we study animals, the more we find mechanisms that are simpler that can explain human behavior. So I see that as, this is sort of my personal perspective on it. I don't know that everybody feels that way. I think that a lot of people view comparative in the sense of comparing one species with another. And it doesn't have to be humans versus other species, but that's my goal, I guess.
So if you're going to give some advice to the younger generation getting ready to get into the field of comparative cognition, what would you tell them are the important things that they need to focus on?
Well, I tend to be fairly practically oriented, so I look and I give students advice all the time about it, and I see the way. I think comparative psychology is probably underappreciated, but the reality is that it's hard to find jobs in the field, and it's hard to get grant support in the field. So this is not the kind of lofty answer maybe you're looking for, but it's a very practical one. So I usually tell my students that they have to do work in some related field as well. So it can be human cognition, it can be developmental psychology, it can be drug research, physiological neuroscience, but they need to pick some other discipline where they can get a job and get funding, and they can continue doing the kinds of theoretical work that we do in the lab alongside or with it. And I think actually some of the more important research is done by people like that who have a good background in comparative psychology and experimental design and can ask the kinds of theoretical questions that need to be asked, and they can ask them with drugs, with neuroscience, or using children and comparing them directly with other others.
Great answer. So is there anything else you'd like to chat about today?
Gee, you're all out of questions?
Well, I do have one more, so I can ask you. But so, what do you think you need to do to make yourself relevant in comparative cognition?
I don't know. I think my approach has been to go where the questions lead you. It doesn't always lead to a single track of programmatic research. But when questions come up, and the diversity of research that I've been involved in has come directly from articles that I've read or my students have brought in, and we discuss them and come up with an important follow-up or a procedural confound, and we follow up on that. And so I think for motivational reasons, I think get excited about some new question that's come up, and then follow up on it. I mean, not just leave it. Especially, often what happens is it leads to other questions. And when the sort of questions peter out a bit, then we move on to something else. So I always have a number of different projects going on in the lab at any time. That also sort of guards against the feeling of failure when the experiment doesn't work out. Somehow you've got other ones, and be excited about the next experiment that's ongoing.
So when you put a lab together, do you like to kind of have some high-risk projects, some low-risk projects, some in between? What's your approach to it?
That's a good way of describing it, yes. And, the low-risk projects are often following on experiments we've already done to tease out some details about it. High-risk projects are like starting on a whole new line of research. The dog research was like that. So maybe imitation research was like that. We'll just come up with a question that we need to work on, and very often it takes a number of experiments to find out what parameters to set. The work that we've done on justification of effort started out as really a challenge by social psychologists. I mean, the outrageous claim about how animals are much like humans, and they said, well, it would never show something like cognitive dissonance. And so that became a challenge, and it took a while. We ran a few experiments before we could find the right procedures for getting the results. So, yeah, that keeps things sort of going to different lines of research, helps a lot, I think.
Anything else you want to say?
Well, put in a plug for the Comparative Cognition Society. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about it, especially with my students, is they get to see that there are a lot of other people doing this kind of research. And I think sometimes they feel somewhat isolated. At the University of Kentucky, there are a lot of other schools that are like that, where there's only one or possibly two people doing that kind of work. The neuroscience people, the human cognition people, generally have more sort of critical mass of faculty, and can sort of get the kind of interactions that they need from within the university. But I think in our area, very often it's meetings like this that really allows them to see, gee, there are a lot of people doing this kind of work. It's not a dying field. And, we just need to be a little more flexible in terms of the kind of jobs we take.
Any way we can help to solve that problem?
Well, we're doing something tomorrow, aren't we? Isn't there a kind of...
We are. We're doing a mentoring program for for students that are interested in developing careers, working with animals in different venues.
That's right, and I think that's great. I think one of the things I tell my students is not to push too much for, if they get interviewed for a job and there aren't animal facilities available, to be very flexible. And, there are zoos around. If once they get there, they can look around for a storage room that's not being used, and you get a rack of cages in there. And usually you can set something up when people aren't ready to commit to establishing an animal lab. You can sort of do it subtly. And I think, in fact, to some degree, I think some of these four-year colleges will be where a lot of the comparative research is done, the laboratory research anyway, because I think at large universities it's becoming more and more difficult to fund the kind of research, and you need funding for it, if only for the per diem charges for animals. At a small college, you can get, the way I started was get the undergraduates who work in the lab to clean cages, and they have their set of cages to do it once a week, but you can't do that anymore. So I think at small colleges you can still do that, or get a work-study student to do that. But now we've got, in addition to lab animal resources, that charges an outrageous amount for
And the ELAC issues. And
oh yeah,
it goes
those
on and
things
on.
too. Right. Yeah.
Well, I've enjoyed our conversation today, Tom, and thank you for your time, and thank you to the Cognition Society.
Thank you for interviewing me. I appreciate it.